Life beneath the gods. Let's drift a little closer now. Past the temples and plazas, down the narrow causeways where the real Maya world unfolded. Daily life, for most people, wasn't carved in stone. It was made of dust, sweat, and cornmeal. A typical Maya home wasn't a palace. It was a low hut made from wattle and daub, sticks plastered with mud, roofed with thatch, built on a small raised platform to keep out the rain. There were no windows, just the open door and the smoke that drifted from a clay hearth in the center. Families slept on reed mats. Children, chickens, and the occasional dog shared the same space. The scent of cooking mingled with wood smoke, and sometimes with the thick sweetness of fermenting maize beer, balshay, the poor man's comfort, brewed in earthen pots and drunk in quiet defiance of exhaustion. Morning began before dawn. The air was cool for only a short while. Men went to the fields, carrying stone-tipped hoes and baskets for corn. Women stayed behind to grind maize on heavy stone slabs. Matats, a rhythm of scraping that sounded like the city's heartbeat. It could take hours to make enough meal for tortillas. There were no shortcuts. Every meal was earned won. Grain at a time, children fetched water, gathered wood, helped tend small gardens where beans climbed wooden poles.
Eat well, my son.
They learned early that survival was a group activity. No one lived easily, but no one lived alone. The Maya loved their families. Though they rarely said it aloud, affection was practical. A meal shared, a wound treated, a story told at dusk. And there were stories, hundreds of them, about gods who made the first humans from maize, dough, about twins who tricked death itself in the underworld, about stars that were once kings and animals that could speak.
The glyphs must be precise.
The past wasn't distant to them. It was alive, breathing, walking beside them. When they lit fires or planted crops, they were continuing a conversation that began at the dawn of time. The burden of King Zati. The top of this quiet pyramid of humanity stood the Kuhul Ajo, the divine ruler. He wasn't just a king. He was a living thread between heaven, earth, and the underworld. If he failed, the universe itself could unravel. Imagine the pressure. A Maya ruler's life was one long performance. Every ceremony, every speech, every drop of blood drawn from his own body was part of keeping cosmic order intact. He wore the feathers of the Quetzal, a bird so sacred that killing one was punishable by death, and headdress plumes so tall he needed attendants just to walk upright. When he appeared in public, it wasn't casual. He emerged like the sun, carried on litters, surrounded by nobles fanning incense smoke. Drums thundered, conch shells blew, and crowds bowed low, convinced that this one man could negotiate with gods. But even divinity comes with paperwork. The king had to oversee tribute, diplomacy, and endless wars. He hosted visiting nobles from rival cities, entertained priests, and endured the flattery of courtiers who all secretly wanted his throne. Royal marriages were political calculations. Each queen was a link in a chain of alliances, chosen for her lineage as much as her looks. Some became powerful in their own right. Women like Lady Six Sky of Naranjo, who ruled as fiercely as any man, leading armies and commissioning monuments to her glory. Others simply disappeared into history, their names recorded in glyphs too faint to read, their lives reduced to titles. The palace might seem splendid. Stone walls, murals painted in red and blue, courtyards echoing with music. But it was still a cage. A royal could not afford to be human. He couldn't show fear, or grief, or hesitation. When the crops failed, it was his failure. When enemies invaded, it was his punishment. When the gods demanded blood, it was his to give. And give it he did. Ritual bloodletting was an art form among the elite. They pierced their tongues, their earlobes, even their genitals, threading cords of bark paper through the wounds to collect the blood. It sounds horrifying, and it was. But it was also theater. A spectacle of devotion, pain transformed into proof of divine favor. The nobles watched. The priests recorded, and the people believed. The fragility of power in the Maya world didn't last, even. The most godlike kings were mortal, and their cities lived and died with them. When a ruler died, he wasn't just buried. He was replanted. His tomb became the seed of renewal, sealed beneath the temple that bore his name. Offerings were placed around him, jade jewelry, obsidian blades, and pottery painted with scenes of his imagined afterlife. His bones became relics. His memory, sacred fuel for the next king's legitimacy. But one bad generation could undo it all. A weak ruler meant unrest, rebellion, drought, all of which the people blamed on divine failure. Cities turned on each other, temples looted rival idols, and whole dynasties collapsed into silence. And when that happened, the jungle waited. It always waited. The Maya built their cities in the rainforest, but the rainforest never truly surrendered. Roots cracked the temples. Vines slid over staircases. The sound of howler monkeys replaced the chants of priests. From a distance, it looked peaceful, but it was the peace of a civilization exhaling its last breath. The slow collapse by the 9th century. The great cities were dying, not all at once, but one by one, like candles burning out in a drafty room. There were droughts, perhaps the worst in centuries. The rivers shrank, the corn withered, and famine followed like a shadow. War became constant, not for glory, but for survival, for captives, for food, for land that still produced. The kings responded the only way they knew how, with more rituals, more sacrifices, more monuments. They built higher pyramids and carved longer inscriptions, as if to shout at the gods through sheer architecture. But the gods stayed silent. Villages were abandoned. Merchants vanished from the roads. Temples were left half-built. People simply walked away. Some fled north toward the Yucatan, founding new cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan. Others scattered into smaller towns, turning their backs on the old divine kings. The age of the great Maya cities was over. The jungle began to reclaim its inheritance, stone by stone, rediscovery and misunderstanding. When Spanish explorers arrived in the 16th century, the Maya world was still alive, but fractured. They found towns, not empires, priests, but no kings. To the Spaniards, it looked like the ruins had been built by an ancient, vanished race. They couldn't imagine the descendants of those builders still living nearby, speaking the same languages, praying to the same gods under new names. So they burned the books. All but 4 Maya codices went up in flames, condemned as devilish. One bishop, Diego de Landa, later regretted it, sort of. He wrote his own account of Maya life, half conversion manual, half apology. Thanks to him, we know just enough to realize how much was lost. For centuries after, European scholars dismissed the Maya as peaceful stargazers who simply faded away. It wasn't until the 20th century, when archaeologists began deciphering the glyphs, that the truth emerged. These were not dreamy philosophers. They were astronomers and warriors, mathematicians and poets. A civilization as complex as any the world has ever seen. Their fall wasn't mysterious. It was human. Overpopulation, war, climate change, and pride. The same forces that have undone every empire since. The legacy of the living, and yet they're still here. More than 7 million Maya people live today across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They speak dozens of related languages. They farm maize. They weave bright textiles with patterns that echo the same stars their ancestors worshipped. The ancient gods still linger, though their names have changed. Catholic saints often wear borrowed faces. St. Peter with the eyes of a maize god. The Virgin Mary dressed like an ancient mother deity. It's not conversion, it's camouflage. In small villages, the old rituals survive. Incense burned before dawn, prayers whispered to mountains and rain clouds. Because even after conquest, after centuries of erasure, the world the Maya made never really ended. It simply shifted shape. Archaeologists dig. Historians write. Tourists take pictures. But for the descendants of the Maya, those temples aren't ruins. They're reminders. Proof that their ancestors once built heaven from stone and endured hell on earth to keep it standing. The end that wasn't an end, so. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is the idea that the Maya disappeared. They didn't. They adapted, as they always had. When the kings fell, the people stayed. When the gods went silent, they whispered new prayers. When the world ended, as it has in their cosmology many times before, they simply began another cycle. Because to the Maya, endings were never final. They were just transitions from season to season, from life to death, from empire to memory. Their story is not one of failure, but of endurance. They built a civilization from stone, time, and faith. And even when all three began to crumble, they kept going. That's what survival looks like. Not triumph, but persistence. And maybe that's what makes them feel so hauntingly human. Not their calendars, but the simple, quiet truth that they kept living, even when the world around them fell apart. As you drift toward sleep, imagine again that humid night in the jungle. The moon hangs over a forgotten pyramid. Somewhere, a farmer lights a fire. The smoke curls upward, thin, pale, almost like a prayer, and fades into the stars that his ancestors once carved into stone. Because the Maya never stopped counting the days, and time, in their world, never stopped beginning again. The richest women no one remembers. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back through time, through the glittering courts and candlelit chambers of the world's forgotten heiresses. So if you're listening in the dark and your room is quiet, this is a good time to let your mind soften a little. You don't need to do anything, just listen, and we'll wander slowly through the palaces and powder rooms of history's richest women, who, somehow, no one remembers. Because history, like money, was not distributed equally. Kings wrote the laws, priests wrote the books, and the women who owned half the continent quietly disappeared into footnotes, or worse, into someone else's name. It's a strange irony that the richest women of the past were often the least visible. They had everything: jewels, land, servants, entire towns that technically belonged to them, but they rarely had stories. Their brothers went to war. Their husbands built statues. They paid for it all, and when the statues were carved and the chronicles written, somehow the names of the financiers slipped away, as if gold itself had no author. So tonight, we're going to remember them, the princesses and duchesses, the heiresses and empresses, who made the world turn on their coin purses, who owned kingdoms but couldn't rule them, who lived in velvet but still had to ask permission, and who, despite everything, managed to leave behind traces of power so immense that even centuries later their shadows are still gilded. Let's start with one of the strangest stories of inherited wealth in Europe, the tale of Margaret of Tyrol, also known as Margaret Maltash. Mouthbag Margaret. Yes, that was her nickname, because, of course, it was. Medieval Europe was many things, but kind about appearances was not one of them. Born in 1318, Margaret inherited the county of Tyrol, a region of mountains, silver mines, and stubborn peasants, one of the most valuable territories in the Holy Roman Empire. She was barely a teenager when she became, quite literally, the most desirable piece of property in Central Europe. Naturally, this made her a political pawn before she could spell inheritance. Her father married her off to the son of the King of Bohemia. Unfortunately, the young man, John Henry, was by all accounts charming in the way a damp sponge is charming. He neglected her, insulted her, and once locked her out of her own castle, which is a power move, if you think about it, but not a romantic one. Margaret's solution was bold. She simply threw him out. Then she married Louis of Brandenburg, without waiting for the Pope's permission. The Pope, predictably, was furious. Margaret was excommunicated, her reputation destroyed. Hence, the nickname Mouthbag, a cruel jab that medieval gossip turned into legend. But Margaret did something few women of her age could. She ruled, with or without the Church's blessing. She controlled Tyrol's trade routes, taxed caravans, and negotiated directly with the emperor. When her enemies called her a sinner, she called in her accountants. When they said she was cursed, she reminded them she owned the roads they used to complain about her. By the time she died in 1369, she had outlived her enemies and passed Tyrol and its immense wealth into the hands of the Habsburgs. They never gave her credit, of course, but they never gave Tyrol back, either. Let's drift a few centuries forward to a very different sort of fortune, to the world of Renaissance Italy, and to Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua. If you've never heard of her, that's entirely normal. She lived from 1474 to 1539, and was, without exaggeration, one of the most cultured, feared, and fabulously rich women in Europe. She owned palaces, art collections, libraries, and, more importantly, influence. She corresponded with popes, kings, and painters. Leonardo da Vinci designed her portrait. Titian painted her. A young Michelangelo begged for her patronage. But Isabella wasn't content to be a muse. She was, in the most elegant sense possible, a control freak. Every letter she sent, and she sent thousands, was perfectly phrased, perfectly calculated, and often perfectly ruthless. When her husband, the Duke of Mantua, was captured during war, Isabella ran the city herself. She negotiated with France, paid mercenaries, and made sure the enemy's armies went home hungry. She also collected art with an almost obsessive devotion. Her private studio, the Studiolo, was a masterpiece of Renaissance taste, filled with paintings, sculptures, and rare manuscripts, all chosen by her own hand. She didn't just want beauty, she wanted legacy. Isabella understood something that her male contemporaries rarely did, that power fades, but taste endures. Her portrait by Titian still hangs in Vienna, her letters are studied by historians, and her descendants, the Gonzagas, rode her fortune for generations. And yet, most people couldn't tell you her name because she wasn't a queen. She was just wealthy. And history doesn't love women who buy their crowns instead of wearing them. Now, while Italy was perfumed with humanism and silk up north, a different kind of rich woman was emerging. One with less marble, more ledgers. Let's meet Jacoba van Byron, or Jacqueline of Bavaria. Born in 1403, 1401, Jacoba inherited a sprawling domain, Holland, Zeeland, and Hainaut, basically a wet, windy chunk of what's now the Netherlands and Belgium. She was a countess, heiress, and target all at once. Her uncles, cousins, and assorted opportunists all wanted her land. So she married strategically. Then she married again, and again. Her life became a carousel of politics and lawsuits. One of her husbands locked her up. Another abandoned her. The Pope got involved, as he often did, and, spoiler, made everything worse. By her 30s, Jacoba had lost most of her territories and much of her freedom. But she never gave up. Even in exile, she refused to live quietly. She threw lavish dinners, kept a full court, and hunted in furs she couldn't really afford anymore. She died young, just 35, but her story marks a fascinating moment in European history. When noblewomen were both property and proprietors, they could inherit wealth, but not wield it freely. They could own armies, but not command them. They could marry kings, but only to make their fathers richer. It was, to put it mildly, an exhausting time to be a millionaire. And yet, the pattern repeats again and again. The richest women of the past were rarely the ones on thrones. They were the ones holding the purse strings behind. Then let's drift to 18th century France, a place where perfume flowed like water, and powdered wigs weighed as much as small pets. Among the countless duchesses and marchionesses, one stood out, Madame de Pompadour. Cranjanen Monthain Finder, Antoinette Poisson, which literally means fish, by the way. She was the daughter of a somewhat shady financier who may or may not have cheated the French crown. But Jeanne was clever. She was educated, witty, and ambitious enough to charm a king, which she did. At 23, she became the official mistress of Louis XV. Now, mistress sounds romantic, but in 18th century France, it was practically a political office. She had her own apartments at Versailles, her own carriages, her own staff. She even had her own minister, and she used that position not just for luxury, but for control. Jeanne, now Madame de Pompadour, arranged marriages, sponsored plays, influenced art, and handpicked ambassadors. She was the one who persuaded the king to support porcelain manufacturing at Sèvres. She patronized Voltaire. She hosted philosophers. She also, naturally, spent money as though it were running out, which, in France's case, it absolutely was. When the court whispered that she'd grown old, she shifted roles from mistress to political advisor. Her enemies called her manipulative. Her friends called her indispensable. She died before the revolution, which was probably for the best, because when that came, no one with her perfume budget would have lasted long. Still, her fingerprints are all over French art and design. Every gilded curlicue and porcelain teacup in Rococo style owes something to her taste. And yet, she's usually remembered only as the king's mistress, which feels a bit like calling Steve Jobs the guy who liked phones. It's a pattern, isn't it? Wealth without legacy. Power without name. Women who shaped nations through money, not armies, and who were punished, in memory, for the quietness of their methods. But not all of them were royal. Some were born to trade, not to crowns, and their stories are somehow even more extraordinary. Let's drift toward one of the most unexpected centers of female wealth in medieval Europe, Venice. The Venetian Republic was built on commerce, spice, silk, glass, and gossip. And while its men ran the ships, its women quietly ran the money. Widows, especially, became key players. When a husband died at sea, his wife often took over his accounts, managed his warehouses, and continued trading. One such woman was Marina Querini, a 14th century widow who controlled an entire fleet of merchant vessels. She loaned money to nobles, bought property across the Adriatic, and funded pilgrimages for half of Venice, purely out of civic pride. Apparently, her fortune was immense. Her signature appears on dozens of contracts, and yet, when historians list Venetian merchants, her name is often missing, because she wasn't supposed to exist. In a world that preferred women silent and scented, she was loud and solvent. So many of these women share that strange contradiction, present everywhere, remembered nowhere. Their coins funded cathedrals. Their dowries built kingdoms. Their estates bankrolled wars their husbands promptly lost. A fragrant beginning. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time long before deodorant aisles and scented candles. A time when the smell of humanity was, let's just say, more of a feature than a flaw. So if you're tucked in and the lights are low, let's settle in together. Take a deep breath, preferably a modern one, and imagine a world without showers, toothpaste, or anything resembling soap as we know it. Because tonight, we're exploring how ancient people kept themselves from smelling horrible, or at least, how they tried to. Now, it's tempting to picture the past as a single, unwashed blur. 1,000 years of peasants stewing in their own juices, noblemen dabbing perfume on top of sweat, and everyone else just hoping for a strong breeze. But the truth is, human beings have always cared deeply, sometimes obsessively, about cleanliness. They just had different methods, and it's worth noting that smelling good and being clean weren't always the same thing. In ancient times, clean could mean spiritually pure, ritually acceptable, or simply not covered in visible grime. Smelling pleasant was a bonus, and often a very expensive one. So, where do we begin our olfactory journey? Let's start with the ancient Egyptians, because of course we will. The Egyptians were the overachievers of hygiene. They shaved their entire bodies, bathed daily, and invented a surprisingly sophisticated range of perfumes and deodorants. Archaeologists have found little alabaster jars of scented oils, solid perfumes made from beeswax, and even recipes for deodorant that included ostrich eggs, carob, and frankincense. It wasn't just about vanity. Cleanliness was tied to holiness. Smelling nice was seen as pleasing to the gods, while being dirty or smelly suggested moral decay. Priests bathed up to 4 times a day. Ordinary people washed in the Nile, or with water poured from clay jugs by helpful children who definitely had opinions about their parents' smell. Perfumes were everywhere, used in religious offerings, funerals, and romantic encounters. One popular scent was kai-fi, a complex blend of honey, wine, cinnamon, raisins, and myrrh, boiled down into a sticky paste that could be burned as incense or worn as a perfume. It was basically the Chanel No. 5 of 1500 BCE, if Chanel No. 5 also kept away mosquitoes. Let's drift a little further east, to Mesopotamia. In ancient Babylon and Sumer, hygiene was also a sign of order, and the gods, as usual, had something to say about it. Clay tablets mention scented oils, perfume soaps made from animal fat and ash, and bathing rituals before prayers. But the real prize of Mesopotamian hygiene wasn't soap. It was oil. People rubbed themselves in oil, then scraped it off again with a bronze tool. A strigil. This wasn't just to clean the skin. It helped remove sweat, dust, and what we might gently call urban residue. In other words, the same system that kept chariot wheels turning was also used on people. The strigil method, by the way, will return again and again throughout history. Because for reasons no one ever fully explained, ancient people absolutely loved scraping things off themselves. Now, across the Aegean, the Greeks were also enthusiastic about cleanliness, at least certain kinds of cleanliness. They were famous for their gymnasia, open-air exercise grounds where men worked out naked, oiled up, and then scraped themselves clean afterward. The result was a pleasant sheen of health and heroism, followed by a smell of oxidized olive oil and warm bronze. Still, compared to many later societies, the Greeks were remarkably hygienic. They bathed frequently, using small tubs or communal baths. They even had early forms of plumbing in some cities. Channels carved from stone to carry away wastewater. The philosopher Plato was said to have bathed sparingly, as a show of discipline. But most ordinary Athenians enjoyed a good soak, especially if someone else was footing the bill. Soap, however, was not really their thing. They considered it a barbarian invention, a messy, foreign substance used by Celts and Germans. Instead, they preferred oil, rubbed on, scraped off, and replaced with a touch of perfume. The result was, let's be diplomatic and call it musky elegance. Then came the Romans, and they made cleanliness into a full-blown social event. If the Greeks oiled and scraped for health, the Romans did it for pleasure, politics, and gossip. Roman bathhouses were enormous, elaborate, and packed from dawn till dusk. You'd start in the tepidarium, a warm room for acclimatizing, then the caldarium, a steaming hot chamber that opened the pores, and finally the frigidarium, where you plunged into cold water to finish off the experience, ideally without dying of shock. It was, in a sense, the ancient version of a spa, except everyone was naked, and senators were probably arguing about tax reform 2 feet away. These baths weren't just for the rich. Even the poorest citizens could afford a dip for a few copper coins. Soap, by this time, had finally made its appearance, though it was still primitive, made from animal fat and lye. Romans sometimes used it, but most preferred the oil and strigil method passed down from the Greeks. Still, they adored perfumes, so much so that the Emperor Nero, Never one to do things modestly, supposedly spent the equivalent of millions of dollars on rose petals and incense. During his parties, it was said that he once had petals fall from the ceiling during a feast, so thickly that a few guests nearly suffocated. A fitting metaphor, really, for the Roman elite. Roman women were particularly fond of scented oils and powders. Some used perfumes made from roses, saffron, or cinnamon. Others mixed crushed minerals for makeup. The wealthy would scent their hair, clothes, even their pets. And as for armpits, the less said, the better. We have written recipes for deodorant, though. Things like orris root, myrrh, and crushed caraway mixed into balms. They didn't stop sweating, of course, but they masked the result, much like a teenager spraying cologne over gym socks. When the Roman Empire eventually collapsed, bathing went somewhat out of fashion, partly because infrastructure collapsed with it, partly because the early medieval church grew suspicious of anything that looked too indulgent, and partly because, well, plague, people still bathed, but less frequently. And when they did, they tended to do it at home, a quick sponge bath rather than a public soak. Soap making, interestingly, survived and even improved. Medieval soap, especially from places like Marseille, was a valuable trade good. But perfume, perfume never went away. If anything, it became more important than ever. Because when you can't wash regularly, you cover the evidence. By the 12th century, Islamic scholars and merchants had brought sophisticated distillation techniques to Europe. This allowed perfumes and scented waters to flourish again. The Islamic world, by the way, had never stopped bathing. Cleanliness was a key part of religious practice. Washing before prayer, cleaning after meals, and bathing regularly. Public bathhouses thrived in places like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, often decorated with mosaics and filled with steam and chatter. So while much of Europe was busy fearing demons in the water supply, the Muslim world was perfecting the art of staying fresh. Let's pause there for a moment, because this contrast says a lot about how people understood hygiene. For the ancients, bathing wasn't just about getting rid of dirt. It was about balance, morality, and belonging. To the Egyptians, it honored the gods. To the Greeks, it was part of physical virtue. To the Romans, it was civilization itself. And to medieval Europeans, well, it was suspiciously enjoyable. Still, even when bathing fell out of favor, people didn't simply give up on hygiene. They adapted. They changed their linens often. They washed their faces and hands. They powdered themselves, combed their hair, and used herbs like lavender or rosemary to scent their clothes. In fact, medieval nobles had linen shirts designed to absorb sweat and be changed daily, long before anyone thought to take a daily bath. Clean clothes meant a clean body, or so the logic went. And honestly, it wasn't entirely wrong. You can stay remarkably presentable if you change your undergarments often enough and pretend not to notice the rest. Now, while Europe was cautiously dabbing itself with rose water, Asia was several steps ahead. In China, personal hygiene had long been a refined art. People bathed with herbal infusions, burned incense in their homes, and brushed their teeth with aromatic twigs. Records from the Tang dynasty mention perfumes made from sandalwood and musk, used to scent clothing and hair. And during the Song dynasty, tooth powders containing salt and herbs were widely used. Yes, they brushed their teeth. Meanwhile, many European nobles were still convinced tooth pain was punishment for sin. By now, you may have noticed a theme. Everyone wanted to smell better than they naturally did. But the line between clean and perfumed was blurry. For some, cleanliness meant purification, a spiritual act. For others, it was social, smelling pleasant enough not to offend anyone important. And for a few, it was just fashion. The Romans drenched themselves in rose oil. The Persians favored ambergris and musk. The Egyptians loved their kaifi, and the medieval French adored violet water, which sounds gentle until you realize it was made with fermented orris root that smelled faintly like damp earth. And yet, no matter the method, from Nile baths to Roman strigils, it all comes down to the same very human truth: nobody likes being the smelly one. What did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? The quiet life of the man with the axe. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of the Middle Ages, the kind of place where the church bells sound a little off-key, and the streets smell faintly of roasted barley, and something that is definitely not roasted barley. And somewhere in that haze, there's a man walking home after a long day at work. He's not a knight. He's not a priest. He's not even a baker. He's the town executioner. And no, he's not dragging a body behind him or practicing his swing in the moonlight, because despite the image that centuries of imagination have given us, most of the time, there simply wasn't anyone to execute. So what did he do instead? Well, he went about his business, and, as it turns out, his business was very odd indeed. Let's start with a little scene setting. Medieval Europe was, contrary to popular belief, not one long public beheading. In many small towns, an execution might only happen once every few months, sometimes just once a year. So if you were the local hangman, or Meister Hans, or Bureau, or Manderschwert, you had to fill your calendar somehow, and you couldn't exactly take a job at the bakery, because you, the executioner, were untouchable, quite literally. People avoided brushing against you in the street, just in case your very skin carried the stain of death. Your house might be on the edge of town, next to the tanneries, or by the river, where the smell of iron and decay blended pleasantly with that of fish. You were needed, but despised, employed, but exiled. A walking paradox with a steady municipal salary. Now, the first thing we should clear up is this. Executioners weren't always born into the job. Sometimes they were criminals themselves. A convicted thief or murderer who'd been offered a curious deal. Do the city's dirty work, and we'll spare your neck. And thus, the new hangman was appointed, often at sword point, with very little training besides swing this thing that way. But if you were born into an executioner's family, well, congratulations. You had inherited one of the most secure yet socially cursed professions in Europe. Executioner dynasties existed for centuries. In places like Nuremberg, Vienna, and Rouen, the same families held the position generation after generation. The Rechbergs, the Sansons, the Fransons, a sort of grim civil service. Their sons were expected to follow in their footsteps, partly because no one else would ever marry them. And their daughters, well, they usually had to marry other executioners, because no respectable family wanted their bloodline tainted by a man who spent his mornings sharpening swords and his afternoons dissecting bodies. And that's really the first clue to what these men did between executions. They worked as healers. Yes, executioners were the go-to medical experts for all the things your local physician wouldn't touch. Dislocated joints, nasty abscesses, infected wounds, because who else had more experience with anatomy than the man who regularly took people apart? Executioners collected knowledge of herbs, pressure points, and surgical tricks that ordinary healers either didn't know or refused to admit. They performed bloodlettings. They drained boils. They even, occasionally, stitched people back together. You'd think no one would go to them for treatment. But when your leg was swelling and blackening, and the licensed doctor was 2 towns away, well, suddenly the hangman didn't seem so bad. There's even a record from 16th century Germany of an executioner who cured the local bishop's gout. He wasn't invited to dinner afterward, of course, but perhaps the most interesting part of this strange arrangement is how practical it all was. You see, medieval cities operated on a curious balance of hypocrisy. Everyone hated the executioner, but everyone needed him. The same man who disposed of bodies also collected stray dogs, cleaned blood from the marketplace, and hauled dead animals out of wells. He was the sanitation department, pest control, coroner, and trauma surgeon all rolled into one. He even handled torture. Interrogations, you see, required a certain finesse, and the hangman was considered a professional at making people talk. It was, technically, part of his civic duty, and yet, despite this rather full schedule, he wasn't allowed to attend church. He couldn't join guilds, and when he walked into a tavern, assuming the owner even let him in, people would quietly finish their drinks and leave. Still, not everything about his life was grim. Executioners had certain privileges. They lived tax-free. They were often given large houses, sometimes with gardens or small plots of farmland, mostly because nobody else wanted to live near them, and they were paid quite well, sometimes even in kind, with beer, bread, or cloth. A few of the more skilled ones, especially those who could kill swiftly and cleanly, gained fame and fortune across the region. There were executioners who traveled, hired out by neighboring towns for big events, because, yes, a royal execution was something of a spectacle. The crowd would gather, the condemned would give a final speech, and all eyes would be on the man with the sword. A good executioner could strike cleanly. One blow, head off, done. A bad one. Well, history remembers them less kindly. Let's just say that some of them had to take 3 or 4 swings, and that's the sort of mistake that follows you around. When there were no executions, though, they often practiced. That's right, they rehearsed. Some used pumpkins or animal carcasses, trying to perfect that one decisive motion. Others would study the anatomy of executed criminals. A gruesome but valuable education in where, exactly, the neck ended and the spine began. In cities like Nuremberg, executioners even kept tools of the trade meticulously labeled and polished. The broadsword, the tongs, the branding irons. Each had a specific purpose, and each was part of a grim but respected craft. There was pride in efficiency. A good executioner was clean, quick, and professional, and his reputation mattered. And speaking of reputations, let's drift over to one of the most famous families in this peculiar line of work, the Sansons of France. The Sanson dynasty provided executioners to Paris for over 150 years. They decapitated nobles during the French Revolution, guillotined Louis XVI himself, and handled tens of thousands of deaths with bureaucratic precision. But even before the Revolution, they were seen as both necessary and repulsive. Charles-Henri Sanson, the most famous of them all, was known as the Gentleman of Paris. He was educated, well-mannered, and apparently had a fondness for fine coats. He also happened to kill people for a living. It was said he never attended social gatherings, but the king himself granted him a seat at certain ceremonies, a polite acknowledgment that even the most glamorous monarchy needed someone to clean up its messes. Charles-Henri was reportedly tormented by his duty. He once remarked that he wished he had been born anything else, and yet he served for over 40 years because, like so many others, he was trapped in the paradox of his profession. Too respectable to be a criminal, too criminal to be respectable. But before the guillotine and the spectacle of revolution, executioners in medieval towns lived simpler, quieter lives. They woke early, fed their animals, sharpened their tools. They might receive a knock at the door, a merchant with a swollen jaw asking for a poultice, or a town official bringing news of an upcoming punishment, a branding perhaps, or a hand to be lopped off. It wasn't always death. Executioners handled lesser sentences too. Floggings, ear clippings, tongue removals, brandings, amputations. Each punishment was an event, sometimes held in the public square to remind everyone to behave. But once the crowd dispersed, and the square was swept, the executioner went home like everyone else. He might feed his chickens, brew ale, even read. Many were surprisingly literate, since they kept careful records of who they punished and when. Their journals survive in fragments, offering a rare window into the mind of a man everyone else tried to ignore. And so, when there were no executions, no crowds, no drums, no trembling prisoners, the executioner simply existed. He lived on the edge of things, half insider, half outcast. He belonged to the town, but not to its people. In a sense, he was the medieval embodiment of the essential worker, despised but indispensable, visible only when something went wrong. His job was the ugly necessity that made civilization possible, and when that necessity paused, when there was no blood to spill, he returned to the quieter duties of keeping the town alive in other ways. Tutine, healing it by cleaning it, by reminding it quietly that justice was not a concept. It was a man with a sword, waiting by the gate. Let's drift over to the next part, to explore what life looked like inside the executioner's household itself. The wives, the children, and the strange, secret world they built on the margins of society. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into their daily lives, the families they raised, the stigma they endured, and the strange rituals that surrounded their work. Because, naturally, Medieval Europe managed to make even death bureaucratic. But for now, close your eyes. Picture a small house beyond the city walls. A man sits outside sharpening a blade while his children play in the dirt, and the town bell tolls faintly in the distance. Tomorrow he might be called to work, or he might spend the day tending his garden. What happened to noblewomen who refused to marry? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when your entire future could be decided before you finished your first bowl of porridge. Time when noble birth was both a blessing and a slow-moving trap. Because while everyone loves to talk about kings and knights and castles, there's a quieter, stranger story hiding behind all that glittering nonsense. The story of what happened to women, specifically noble women, who decided not to play the marriage game. Now, this wasn't an easy thing to do. Refusing to marry wasn't like turning down an invitation to a tedious dinner party. It was more like slamming the door on the entire economic, political, and moral structure of your world. And yet, some of them tried, some said no, some stalled, and some found very creative ways to avoid being handed over like a prize cow in a diplomatic transaction. So tonight, let's dim the lights, exhale, and drift back through a few centuries of high-born women who didn't marry, and what that actually meant for them. Spoiler: it was rarely a happy ending, but it was almost always an interesting one. Let's start with the basics. In most of medieval and early modern Europe, marriage wasn't about love. It was about land, alliances, and heirs, in that order. Romance was something you did quietly with the wrong person after the wedding. For noble families, every child was a potential bargaining chip. Sons extended the family's influence through inheritance and warfare. Daughters, well, they extended it through their uteruses. If you were born noble and female, your fate was a contract waiting to happen. From the moment you learned to walk, people were already discussing what kind of dowry you might fetch, and which vaguely related cousin or foreign duke's nephew you might someday be shipped off to marry. So refusing to marry wasn't just personal defiance, it was an economic inconvenience. Tea was like a piece of royal machinery suddenly, deciding it didn't want to turn anymore. There were, however, acceptable loopholes. If you didn't want to marry, you could take the veil. Becoming a nun was the socially sanctioned escape hatch for women who didn't or couldn't marry. It wasn't necessarily seen as rebellion, or like a consolation prize for being inconvenient. Of course, taking the veil covered a lot of possibilities. Some women genuinely wanted the spiritual life. They sought peace, learning, and a degree of independence unavailable anywhere else. Others were strongly encouraged. By encouraged, I mean locked in convents until they agreed. Medieval chronicles are surprisingly blunt about this. You'll read things like, "She entered the convent willingly, under her father's supervision," which usually meant she was dragged there crying while her brothers blocked the door. For the family, it was efficient. A nun didn't need a dowry as large as a bride, and she couldn't produce inconvenient heirs who might later claim property. For the woman, it was tolerable depending on the convent. Some were strict and joyless. Others were basically noble women's boarding schools with decent food and poetry readings. A few even became intellectual centers, like the famous abbeys of Fontevraud or Whitby, where women studied Latin, managed estates, and occasionally lectured bishops about theology. But for every enlightened abbess, there were a dozen silent, resigned women staring out of narrow cloister windows, watching their lives slip by. Let's drift over to one such reluctant holy woman, Joan, the daughter of King John II of France. Born in 1351, Joan was destined, like most royal daughters, to marry for political convenience. She was engaged to the heir of Aragon until diplomacy fell apart, and the engagement was quietly dropped. Then the plague hit. Her father was captured in battle. France went bankrupt, and somewhere amid the chaos, Joan's marriage prospects evaporated, so she was sent to a convent, not out of piety, but practicality. Her family couldn't afford to fund her dowry anymore, and unmarried princesses were expensive to maintain. So off she went, to a life of prayers, silence, and embroidery. She became an abbess eventually, ruling over other noble-born women in the same predicament. And while the records suggest she was dutiful and obedient, there's a sad irony there. A princess born to rule a kingdom ended up ruling a handful of nuns. It's the medieval version of being demoted from CEO to regional manager. Some noble women, though, refused to go quietly into the cloister. Take Isabella d'Este, the Italian Renaissance noblewoman who refused to let her family choose her path. She did marry, eventually, but only after an extremely prolonged series of negotiations, in which she more or less dictated the terms herself. Before that, she spent years politely rejecting suitors who didn't meet her exacting standards, including one who apparently had bad table manners. She became one of the most powerful patrons of art and culture in Italy, ruled her husband's city when he was away, and once personally negotiated with invading French generals. But Isabella was the exception, the rare woman who had both status and intelligence in sufficient quantities to force the world to take her seriously. Most women who refused marriage didn't have that luxury. They were pressured, disinherited, or quietly erased. Let's pause for a moment on inheritance, because this is where things got particularly cruel. In many European legal systems, daughters could inherit only if there were no sons, and even then, they usually didn't get full control of their property. It transferred to their husbands upon marriage. So if a noblewoman refused to marry, her land effectively stagnated. It couldn't be passed to the next generation. It couldn't be politically leveraged. It just sat there. Legally owned by a woman, society didn't quite know how to categorize. Some families solved this by quietly confiscating her property. Others appointed male guardians to manage her affairs indefinitely. It was a little like being put under house arrest, except the prison was your own dowry. Of course, not every refusal was noble or philosophical. Sometimes women refused because they genuinely hated their prospective husbands. And given how many of these matches were between teenage girls and middle-aged men with gout, it's hard to blame them. Take Renée of France, daughter of King Louis XVIII. She was forced to marry Ercole II d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, a match she despised so thoroughly that she ended up under house arrest for her Protestant sympathies. She later refused to remarry after his death, declaring that she'd had quite enough of dukes. Thank you very much. Instead, she spent her remaining years in France, quietly running her estates and funding religious reformers. It wasn't freedom in the modern sense, but it was the closest she could get. Then there were the ones who simply disappeared from the record. In royal genealogy books, you'll sometimes see a daughter's name followed by a polite blank space. No marriage recorded. No death date, just gone. These were often the inconvenient ones, women who refused their assigned roles and were quietly folded out of history. Some did end up in convents. Others were sent to distant estates, where they lived out their lives managing servants and supervising harvests. A few, remarkably, managed to live independently. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as widows gained more legal autonomy, unmarried noblewomen could sometimes act as landowners in their own right, if they were rich enough, old enough, and stubborn enough to get away with it. But they still faced social ridicule. In polite circles, an unmarried woman over 25 was often called a spinster, a word that literally meant one who spins thread, because spinning was the sort of humble, domestic work reserved for women with nothing better to do. Even noble spinsters were mocked in court gossip. Too proud, too strange, or too ugly to marry. Those were the usual accusations. It never seemed to occur to anyone that maybe they just preferred peace and personal space over being legally owned by someone named Henry. Still, the unmarried noblewoman was a paradox. On one hand, she had no husband to control her, a small, rare taste of freedom. On the other, that very freedom made her vulnerable. Without a man's legal protection, she could be sued, disinherited, or accused of scandal with very little evidence. Gossip was a weapon, and idle noble courts loved to wield it. Unmarried women were often rumored to be witches, or lovers of priests, or plotting to seduce someone's husband, sometimes all at once. The logic was simple. If a woman wasn't married, there must be something wrong with her, either physically, morally, or both. It's remarkable how consistent that sentiment has remained across the centuries. But despite the gossip, the ridicule, and the legal obstacles, there's something quietly admirable about these women. They lived in societies that defined them by the men they were attached to, and yet they found ways to exist alone. Whether in convents, estates, or crumbling family manors, they carved out little spaces of autonomy, spaces where they could read, pray, manage property, or simply be left alone. It's easy to romanticize it now, to imagine them as proto-feminist icons, but in truth, their solitude was often born of necessity rather than choice. Still, in a world that demanded obedience, their refusal remains a quiet form of rebellion. And as we drift toward the next part of our story, we'll meet some of those women. The ones who refused to marry, and the ones who couldn't, and the ones who found very creative ways to get around the problem altogether. What happened to royal mistresses? When they got old? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the soft candlelight of royal bedchambers. The sort that smelled faintly of rose water, gilt, and far too much velvet. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe pour a cup of tea, or something stronger. And let's talk about a rather uncomfortable question that most official history books skip. What happened to royal mistresses when they got old? It's one of those questions that history tends to sidestep politely, like a relative no one wants to mention at dinner. The glamorous royal mistress, draped in silks, whispered about at court, showered with jewels, is a familiar image. But the story usually ends there, just as the candle burns low. What we rarely hear about is what came after. Because behind every glittering love affair at court, there came the inevitable moment when youth faded, fashions changed, and the king's wandering eye wandered elsewhere. And that left the former mistress, once the most powerful woman in the room, wondering what to do with her life when the crown no longer cared. So tonight, let's wander through a few centuries of royal heartbreak, powdered wigs, and quiet exiles. We'll meet women who ruled the boudoir like empires, and then had to learn how to fade with some degree of grace, or at least with a pension. Let's start in France, because of course we will. France practically industrialized the mistress system. The French even had a title for it, maîtresse en titre, the official, state-recognized royal mistress. It was less of a romantic role and more of a courtly office. Imagine being both the king's lover and, somehow, his unofficial Minister of Interior Decoration. One of the most famous was Madame de Pompadour, mistress to Louis XV. She wasn't just a fling. She was the central decorative feature of the French monarchy for nearly 20 years. She advised the king, commissioned art, planned architecture, and apparently managed to flirt while discussing tax reform, an impressive skill set. But by her mid-30s, things began to slow down. The king, after all, was Louis XV, known for his restless pursuit of youth and novelty. When she fell ill and could no longer participate in the more physical duties of her position, Pompadour made a pragmatic decision. She stayed anyway. She pivoted from mistress to confidant, from the king's lover to his therapist, decorator, and general emotional support human. Her secret was adaptation. She surrounded herself with artists, philosophers, and clever conversation. And remarkably, she managed to remain one of the most powerful people in France long after their affair was purely platonic. In short, she aged strategically, but most mistresses weren't quite that lucky. Let's drift over to England, where the royal mistress was often treated as a mix between national embarrassment and beloved celebrity. Take Nell Gwynn, mistress to Charles II. She was witty, charming, and most importantly, funny. The kind of woman who could diffuse scandal with a one-liner. When an angry mob mistook her for one of the king's French mistresses, she leaned out of her carriage and shouted, "Good people, I am the Protestant whore," and instantly became a folk hero. But charm only lasts so long. When Charles died, Nell's protection vanished with him. The next king, James II, wasn't a fan of his brother's leftover mistresses, and Nell was quickly stripped of royal favor. She died in her 30s, largely forgotten and heavily in debt. For women like her, there was no retirement plan, no title, no estate, just fading perfume and unpaid bills. It's easy to imagine the quiet heartbreak that followed the laughter, like a play ending mid-scene. Now, of course, there were exceptions. Some mistresses did receive titles and land, tokens of gratitude, or perhaps guilt. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it became fashionable for kings to ennoble their mistresses before dismissing them, a final flourish of generosity, before moving on to someone younger and less argumentative. In England, Charles II gave his various mistresses estates and dukedoms, though none of them ever truly escaped the shadow of scandal. Barbara Palmer became the Duchess of Cleveland, Louise de Querouaille, the Duchess of Portsmouth. They had money, yes, but also reputations so infamous that polite society rarely looked them in the eye. Imagine living in a grand house, surrounded by portraits that reminded everyone of what, exactly, you were famous for. It's no wonder many of these women retreated to the countryside, nursing grudges and gout in equal measure. Across the Channel, the French approach remained both crueler and more refined. Louis XIV's court was a carefully staged theater of power. The king's mistresses were central characters until they weren't. His first official mistress, Louise de la Vallière, began as a shy gentlewoman who genuinely loved him, which was, of course, her first mistake. When she grew tired of his infidelities, she tried to leave court. Louis, predictably, refused to let her go. Eventually, after years of humiliation, she retired to a Carmelite convent. There, she spent the rest of her life in prayer and penitence, wearing sackcloth and sleeping on straw. She called herself the miserable sinner. One might say she traded silk sheets for hair shirts. Her replacement, Madame de Montespan, fared only slightly better. Brilliant, temperamental, and magnificently rude, she dominated the king's court for over a decade. But when her beauty began to fade, and a scandal involving black masses and love potions erupted, she was quietly removed from favor. She, too, retired to a convent, a rather expensive one, naturally. It's a recurring theme. The royal mistress, once worshipped like a goddess, ending her days in prayer, isolation, or exile. It seems that the convent was Europe's version of a dignified off-ramp, a polite way to disappear. But not every mistress went quietly. Some aged defiantly, determined to remain relevant. Madame du Barry, Louis XV's final mistress, was one such woman. She entered the palace young, beautiful, and dazzlingly unqualified. Even the courtiers whispered that she'd started her career as a courtesan. A bit of a stretch, but one that conveniently ignored the king's enthusiasm. Du Barry was, to put it gently, not an intellectual. But she had charm, kindness, and impeccable taste in jewelry. When Louis died, she was unceremoniously banished from Versailles, yet she managed to return to polite society, until the French Revolution arrived, and suddenly her past became her death sentence. In 1793, she was arrested and executed by guillotine. Her last words were, supposedly, "Encore un moment, Monsieur le Bourreau." One moment more, Mr. Executioner. A final, tragic attempt to delay the inevitable. It's a strange symmetry, dying beneath the same revolution that destroyed the world of glittering indulgence she once ruled. Over in Spain, things were no less awkward. King Philip IV was devoted to his mistress, Maria Calderón, a former actress. When she grew older and inconvenient, he quietly arranged for her to join a convent, a pattern you might be noticing. Meanwhile, his son, Charles II, the famously inbred and physically fragile monarch, wasn't much of a lover at all. His poor health and childlike temperament made mistresses a non-issue. One could argue that the women of Spain dodged a bullet there. But in other courts, like Russia's, where Catherine the Great reigned, the mistress system reversed entirely. Catherine, famously, was the one choosing companions. And unlike most kings, she had a retirement plan. When she tired of a lover, she'd send him off with land, titles, and sometimes even a wife, essentially promoting him to former royal favorite. Now financially stable, it was practical, generous, and a little bit terrifying. But let's return to England, where the post-mistress phase became more public than ever. In the 18th and 19th centuries, royal affairs became harder to hide. Newspapers thrived on gossip. Caricaturists gleefully sketched aging mistresses, and the idea of royal propriety began to matter. When George IV abandoned his mistress Maria Fitzherbert for a series of political and financial reasons, the scandal filled every salon in London. Fitzherbert was left with neither title nor recognition. Her marriage to the king had been illegal under British law, but she kept her dignity. She grew older quietly, devoted to her faith and her privacy. When George died, his will demanded that she be treated with respect, which, in royal terms, meant they didn't slander her too loudly. In her portraits from later years, Maria looks serene, poised, unbothered, and almost smug, as though she knew that, in the end, she'd aged more gracefully than he did. So, what can we learn from all of this? Royal mistresses lived like butterflies, glorious, brief, and always one cold breeze away from extinction. Their youth was their currency, their beauty, their job security, and when those faded, they had two options: reinvent themselves, or retreat from the stage entirely. Some did both. Madame de Pompadour became an art patron. Louise de la Vallière became a nun. Madame du Barry became a ghost of her own legend. But underneath all the glamour, the jewels and the portraits, they shared the same quiet truth. Once the king's attention wandered, the rest of the world followed, because for all their power, mistresses were never meant to last. Let's drift, then, to one final image. A grand chateau outside Paris. The gardens are still immaculate, though no one visits much anymore. Inside, a woman once adored by a king sits by a window, embroidering. Her reflection looks older than she remembers. She smiles faintly, perhaps thinking of the past, not with regret, but with a kind of weary amusement. What did executioners do when they weren't executing people? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, grimmer corner of medieval and early modern life, to talk about a group of people everyone knew, but no one wanted to talk to. Executioners, the men who swung the sword, dropped the axe, or pulled the lever, the ones who ended lives, professionally, and then had to figure out what to do for the rest of the week. Because here's the thing, most people don't realize. Executions didn't happen that often. Even in the bloodiest centuries, a city might have a handful of executions a year, maybe one every few months, which raises the rather awkward question, what did these men do with all their free time? You can't exactly list executioner on your CV and then pick up some light clerical work. Society needed them desperately and despised them completely. They were essential and untouchable, respected and reviled, often all at once. So tonight, we're going to settle in, dim the lights, and wander through the strange, lonely lives of the men who did the dirty work of justice and then went home to feed their chickens, because, surprisingly, executioners were more than just public killers. They were healers, butchers, cleaners, tax collectors, and sometimes the most gossiped about people in town. Let's begin where most of these stories do, at the edge of a medieval city wall. In the typical European city of the Middle Ages, the executioner lived just outside the gates. It wasn't exactly by choice. Executioners were legally required to live beyond the walls, close enough to be available, far enough that their neighbors didn't have to make awkward eye contact. Their homes were easy to spot, a little isolated, often marked with black paint or a red post. In some German towns, the area was called the Hangman's Meadow, which, you'll agree, doesn't sound like a great place to raise children. Inside, things were surprisingly normal. Many had wives, children, and gardens. They owned dogs, chickens, and the occasional horse. They were paid by the city, often with a regular salary, plus bonuses for each execution, the medieval equivalent of overtime. But the rest of the time, they had to make a living. And that's where things get, unexpectedly, fascinating. When you weren't executing, you were probably butchering. Executioners were experts with knives, steady hands, strong stomachs, and an understanding of anatomy. So naturally, they doubled as the town butchers. It made sense if you ignored the optics. After all, both jobs involved cutting up bodies. One just moved first. Of course, this overlap caused some discomfort. People liked their meat, but they didn't love knowing it had been carved by the same man who decapitated their neighbor last week. Still, necessity tends to outweigh squeamishness. In Nuremberg, for example, the city executioner was explicitly allowed to sell meat. Some even ran their own stalls in the market, though customers sometimes wore gloves to avoid physical contact. Because here's another grim detail. Executioners were considered unclean. Touching one could, in theory, contaminate you. They were believed to carry spiritual pollution, the residue of death. So people avoided shaking hands, lending tools, or even drinking from the same cup. In polite company, they didn't exist, but when you needed a pig slaughtered, suddenly everyone remembered their address. When they weren't butchering, executioners often worked as healers. Yes, really. It turns out, when you spend a lifetime cutting into bodies, you accidentally learn quite a lot about how they work. Executioners became folk surgeons and bone setters, treating wounds, extracting teeth, and setting broken limbs. And since few towns had licensed doctors, their services were in high demand, particularly among the poor, who couldn't afford anyone else. The irony was delicious. The man who broke bones on Monday might be resetting them on Tuesday. Some were even renowned for their skill. Take Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg in the late 1500s. He kept meticulous journals of his work, both executions and medical treatments. Over 45 years, he executed 394 people and healed more than 15,000. He was so respected. Eventually, the city granted him full citizenship and even noble status. An astonishing reversal for someone born into hereditary shame. But most weren't so lucky. For every Franz Schmidt, there were dozens of others who died alone, unacknowledged, and often buried outside consecrated ground, because in the eyes of medieval society, an executioner wasn't just a man, he was a necessary evil. Let's drift a little deeper into that idea. The medieval and early modern world ran on hierarchy, on the belief that every person had their God-appointed place. Kings ruled, priests prayed, and executioners killed. They were part of the divine order, yet excluded from it. Church law even barred them from sacraments. They couldn't receive communion, stand as godparents, or be buried in churchyards. Their children inherited the stigma automatically. In some places, the entire executioner's family line was legally designated as dishonorable. That meant they couldn't enter most professions, join guilds, or marry outside their social group. So, executioners married other executioners' daughters, generation after generation. It created small dynasties of death, families who passed down the trade like an heirloom. In Germany, names like Reindel, Rattenberger, and Schmidt appear in executioner records for centuries. It wasn't so much a career as a hereditary curse. You didn't apply for the job, you inherited it. Still, for all the isolation, the work had perks. Executioners were paid decently, sometimes even lavishly. Cities understood that if you wanted someone to handle the messy business of justice, you had to make it worth their while. They often received free housing, tax exemptions, and the right to collect certain fines. In some regions, they even got to keep the clothes of the executed, a small but lucrative bonus, since garments were valuable. There's a slightly grim record from Augsburg, where an executioner requested 1/2 of each criminal's clothing, clean and intact. He also asked for a sufficient supply of wine, which feels deeply relatable. And speaking of wine, that was another part of the job. Executioners were expected to attend executions drunk, not out of cowardice, but to steady their nerves. Many drank heavily before, during, and after their duties. Some said it dulled the shaking. Others, the guilt. It's not hard to see why the profession attracted both Stoics and alcoholics. Sometimes the same man. When there were no executions, taxes still had to be collected, and someone had to do the unpleasant parts. Executioners were often used as enforcers of local ordinances, collecting debts, confiscating property, or expelling undesirables from the city. They might also clean the streets, dispose of animal carcasses, or supervise the removal of human remains after battles or epidemics. Essentially, if a task was unpleasant, dangerous, or socially contaminating, it was theirs. They dealt with the dead, the diseased, and the disgraced. It's hard not to feel a quiet pity for them, because in a way, they performed the same function as modern sanitation workers, keeping society clean by doing what everyone else refused to touch. They just had more blood involved. Some executioners tried to humanize the work. They developed rituals, small gestures of mercy to comfort the condemned. Before an execution, they might offer a drink of wine or whisper a brief prayer. Many prided themselves on being quick and professional. A clean cut was a mark of honor. There's a famous anecdote from 17th century England about Jack Ketch, a notoriously clumsy executioner who bungled several beheadings. After one disastrous performance, A dying prisoner reportedly forgave him, saying, "I forgive you with all my heart for what you are about to do." Ketch's reputation was ruined. To this day, his name is still slang for hangman. But for every Jack Ketch, there were dozens of nameless men who quietly did their duty, neither cruel nor kind, simply necessary. And when they weren't executing, they were gardening, brewing beer, raising children who couldn't play with anyone else's. The horror was not in their actions, but in their loneliness. There's a strange duality in all of this. Executioners stood at the intersection of justice and shame. They embodied the state's power and its guilt. Society couldn't function without them, but it also couldn't fully accept them. So it kept them close enough to summon, but far enough to forget. Their homes outside the walls were physical metaphors for their status. Indispensable, but exiled, and yet they endured. Some carved out quiet respectability. Others faded into myth. When executions became less frequent in the 18th and 19th centuries, many families reinvented themselves as veterinarians, surgeons, or policemen. The skills transferred surprisingly well. The last hereditary executioner in Germany, Johann Reichardt, performed his final duties in the mid-20th century. A reminder that this isn't ancient history. So, what did executioners do when they weren't executing people? They lived, awkwardly, quietly, somewhere between terror and necessity. They cut meat, healed wounds, cleaned streets, collected debts, and drank heavily. They were men paid to embody society's violence, and then politely vanish until needed again. And in the soft candlelight of history, they remind us that civilization has always relied on someone willing to get their hands dirty. Someone had to do it, and someone always did. How did people in the Middle Ages actually go insane? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, that foggy stretch of time between the fall of Rome and the rise of indoor plumbing, to talk about something quietly unsettling. Not knights or plagues or peasants this time, though we'll pass a few of those along the way. No, tonight we're exploring what happened when medieval people lost their minds. What did insanity even mean in a world before modern medicine? How did families deal with it when there were no psychiatrists, no hospitals, and very little patience for unpredictable behavior? It's a question that feels both distant and strangely familiar. Because for all their superstition and candles and chanting monks, medieval people were still people. They got depressed, anxious, paranoid, obsessive. They broke down under grief or guilt or stress. They saw things that weren't there, and they terrified everyone else in the process. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Let's wander through the quiet corridors of medieval madness, from cursed kings and haunted nuns to farmers who thought they were made of glass. And, as always, let's do it very, very slowly. In the Middle Ages, going insane wasn't a medical diagnosis. It was a moral one. If someone behaved strangely, muttering to themselves, laughing at nothing, claiming to see visions, It wasn't because of mental illness. It was because something or someone had gotten inside them. A demon, perhaps, or a curse, or on good days, the Holy Spirit. The medieval mind didn't separate the body, the soul, and the mind the way we do. You were one connected whole. So if your thoughts went wrong, the assumption was that your soul had gone wrong too. Naturally, this led to a few unfortunate misunderstandings. Let's start with something fairly common: melancholy. Medieval physicians actually recognized melancholy as a distinct state, the result of an imbalance in the body's black bile, one of the four humors that were supposed to control everything from your personality to your digestion. Too much black bile, they said, made you gloomy, withdrawn, and pessimistic. You'd lose interest in food, pleasure, or even prayer. In other words, you'd be depressed. Their treatments were inventive. You could be bled, of course, always a crowd favorite. Or you might be prescribed warm baths, soft music, and walks in fresh air. Some doctors even recommended reading poetry, which is rather touching in a hopeless sort of way. But if melancholy lingered too long, the church got involved. Because deep sadness might not just be an illness, it might be a sin. You could be accused of sloth, despair, or lack of faith. Monks suffering from depression were warned against acedia, a kind of spiritual laziness that made them neglect their prayers. So, imagine being clinically depressed, and then being told it's your fault for not being cheerful enough in front of God. Naturally, that made things worse. Now, let's drift to the other end of the spectrum. Madness that frightened people. There were the wild ones, people who screamed, tore at their clothes, or ran naked through the streets claiming to be Jesus. In medieval towns, there was no subtle way to handle this. You might be tied up, locked away, or paraded through the streets for public pity or amusement. Some cities did have fools, people with visible disabilities or mental illness, who were tolerated in a sort of grimly affectionate way. Others became local legends: the mad, hermit, or the blessed idiot, seen as touched by God. The boundaries between madness and holiness were thin and flexible. A woman who saw visions might be declared a saint or a heretic, sometimes both, depending on how annoying she was to her local priest. One of the most famous medieval madmen was King Charles VI of France, also known, somewhat unkindly, as Charles the Mad. He began his reign as a handsome, promising young man, charming, generous, and apparently sane. But in his mid-20s, things began to unravel. During one campaign, he suddenly turned on his own soldiers, shouting that they were traitors, and killed several before being restrained. Afterward, he fell into a catatonic state, refusing to recognize his wife or children. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass, a delusion so specific that it became famous across Europe. He refused to let anyone touch him for fear he'd shatter. He even had his clothes reinforced with iron rods to protect his fragile body. It's called the glass delusion. and it wasn't unique to Charles. For several centuries, wealthy and educated Europeans developed a bizarre fear that they were literally made of glass, fragile, transparent, and breakable. Modern historians think it was a metaphorical illness, a physical manifestation of extreme anxiety, perhaps triggered by courtly pressure, confinement, or trauma. But at the time, it was just madness. And because Charles was king, no one could exactly lock him up, so they managed his insanity as best they could. His court tiptoed around him, politics crumbled, and France slid into civil war. Because of course it did. A mad monarch was a dangerous luxury. Meanwhile, for ordinary people, there was no royal physician or padded wardrobe. If your madness was mild, muttering, confusion, strange laughter, you might be tolerated. Families often kept relatives at home, partly out of love, partly because there was nowhere else to send them. But if your behavior turned violent, you might end up chained in a local dungeon, or confined by a monastery for your own good. Some monasteries specialized in this. There were even cells designed for troubled souls, where the mentally ill could be locked away and visited by monks who prayed for their healing. Sometimes that meant being sprinkled with holy water. Sometimes it meant exorcisms that went on for days. And sometimes it meant nothing at all, because even the church didn't really know what to do. Of course, not every form of insanity looked like possession or despair. Some were strangely specific, what we might now call mass psychogenic illness. One famous example was the dancing plague of 1518, when hundreds of people in Strasbourg began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. They danced for days, without rest, until some reportedly died of exhaustion. No one knows exactly why. Some thought it was mass hysteria, brought on by stress and famine. Others blamed it on poisonous mold, or, predictably, demons. Either way, the medieval authorities' response was classic. They built a stage, hired musicians, and told everyone to dance it out. Naturally, this made it worse. For women, mental illness was a particularly dangerous label. A woman who heard voices might be seen as divinely inspired, if those voices said something flattering about the church. But if they didn't, well, then she was clearly possessed. The line between mystic and madwoman was paper thin. Take Marjorie Kempe, an English merchant's wife who, after a difficult childbirth, began experiencing intense visions of Christ. She wept loudly, for hours, in public, and spoke constantly of her spiritual marriage to Jesus. People called her hysterical, scandalous, possibly insane. But Marjorie insisted she was chosen. She dictated her experiences in what became the first autobiography in English, The Book of Marjorie Kempe. Reading it now, it's hard to tell whether she was mentally ill, devout, or simply determined to be heard. But in her time, her behavior was radical. In an age where women's emotions were pathologized, Marjorie managed to turn her tears into power. She traveled, preached, and survived multiple accusations of heresy, which, honestly, is more than most sane people managed. There were, of course, More tragic stories. Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant girl who led armies and claimed to hear saints, was also accused of madness. Her voices told her to save France. The church decided they must be demonic. She was interrogated, humiliated, and finally burned at the stake. Centuries later, she'd be canonized as a saint. So, to recap, mad, then holy, then symbolic, depending entirely on who was writing the paperwork. It's a perfect medieval summary. And through all of this, there's an odd tenderness hidden in the chaos. For all their superstition, some medieval people did try to care for the mentally ill. Monastic hospitals often took in the disturbed, offering food, shelter, and prayer. It wasn't modern therapy, but it was something. In some towns, a local fool might be fed by the community, pitied rather than punished. The mentally ill were both feared and protected, like sacred mysteries, too strange to understand, too human to discard. It's easy to think of the Middle Ages as cruel and ignorant, but amid the chanting and the chains, there were moments of quiet mercy. A monk sitting beside a man who mutters at shadows. A mother keeping her troubled son at home, whispering prayers over him each night. A village that learns to live with the strange woman who talks to invisible saints. They didn't understand mental illness, but they recognized suffering. And sometimes that was enough. As we drift toward the end of this first part, imagine the medieval night. The village is quiet. The air smells faintly of wood smoke. Somewhere, a man talks softly to himself in the dark, and the neighbors cross themselves before going to bed. Tomorrow, he might be taken to a monastery, or left alone, or perhaps he'll wake up perfectly sane again, because that, too, was part of the mystery. No one really knew what madness was, or why it came and went. They just knew it was there, a shadow at the edge of the candlelight, and in their own strange way, they tried to make peace with it.